welcome back to the channel. Today in this video, we're going to be interviewing Professor Glenn Schwartz, who is an expert in archaeology and in the Sumerian civilization. And he also discovered the oldest alphabetic scripts, and we're going to be learning how did his research impact our knowledge, well, on ancient civilizations. So let's dive right into it.
If what I'm proposing is right, then indeed I have found the oldest example of alphabetic writing currently known, which dates to something like 2350 BC. These civilizations, they had a big effect on their physical environments. They had to cultivate more and more farmland, which means they had to cut down lots of trees, get as much food out of their fields as they could, and that had an effect on the environment. So that there could be environmental degradation that occurred. Archaeology involves many different skills, which is one of the things I love about it. It isn't just a single thing. You have to learn how to analyze ancient cities and ancient objects and all that, but you also have to learn how to work as a team and also to direct a team.
So here, guys, we have the man himself, Professor Glenn Schwartz, a professor of archaeology at the Johns Hopkins University. And so, well, we're going to be asking him about some questions of his research, but first of all, more about what inspired him to start his passion for archaeology and his research, and then we can go more about questions in his research. So, first of all, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here, Mr. Glenn Schwartz, Professor Glenn Schwartz. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Well, hi. And so, first of all, why don't we start by, well, knowing what you do. So, what do you do in your career?
Well, I'm an archaeologist, as you know, which has a number of different components. So I'm a professor, as you mentioned, at Johns Hopkins University. That means part of my job is to teach. So, of course, I teach undergraduate classes and classes that are kind of introductory to what archaeology is all about. I'm a specialist in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, also known as the ancient Middle East. So a lot of my classes involve the archaeology of that part of the world. So I teach undergraduate classes. I also teach graduate classes. Those are people that are studying to get the PhD. So those are more advanced classes and usually more like seminars, and they're smaller classes, right? So that's teaching, but then another part of my work, of course, is the actual archaeological research. Everybody knows, or I think most people know, that archaeologists go and dig up ancient cities, ancient villages, ancient sites, whatever. And that is part of my job. So throughout my career, I did a lot of field work, excavations in Syria. And then after Syria became impossible due to the civil war, I moved over to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So we had projects in Syria and Iraq. But also, when you're digging, you're collecting a lot of information, a lot of data. And so you need time to actually analyze the data and to publish the data. So that's also a very big part of what I do.
Well, very interesting. And so, well, what actually inspired you to get into archaeology and getting into all of this research in Syria?
I was pretty young. I think I was 8 years old or so. And I had seen a movie that was set in ancient Egypt. It was called The Egyptian. It was a big Hollywood blockbuster from the 1950s. And I was just captivated by the idea that people had lived so long ago, so far away, wearing all these weird-looking clothes and with weird-looking houses and art and everything, and yet were like us. So I started reading about ancient Egypt and about the ancient Near East in general, and it became my fixation. It was like, my hobby, just to read about that sort of stuff. It wasn't like I wanted to dig in my backyard or anything like that. It was that I was fascinated by the people of the ancient Near East and what they did. Um, and when I went to college, I deliberately applied to colleges where you could study the ancient Near East. And when I was in college, I realized that there were two directions you could go in. One was to study the ancient languages and the ancient written texts. And the other was to actually go and excavate the sites which is where the ancient people lived, and to learn about their architecture and their tools and their ways of life and all sorts of other things that you get from just digging. And I decided I didn't want to just be stuck in an office reading text for the rest of my life. I wanted to do something that was not as sedentary, that, that more on the move and more adventurous. So that's why I decided to go for archaeology.
Nice. All right. You just got inspired from a movie and then the rest just came on.
Well, of course, it was a long trajectory. I had to learn about how do you study the ancient Near East? And then if I wanted to do archaeology, how do you do archaeology?
Mm.
So, you have to learn a lot in different ways. The reason I started working in Syria is simply because of my professor. So I was a student, a graduate student, PhD student at this time, a beginning PhD student at Yale, which is where I went to school. And my professor had intended to start doing field work in Iran. And I had been to Iran, I had gotten some experience in Iran, and I thought, okay, I'm going to focus on Iran. But then the Iranian Revolution happened, and it wasn't possible for Americans to go to Iran anymore. So my professor, Harvey Weiss at Yale, he's still teaching there. He had to look for another place to work, and he got this inspired idea to try Syria. And there weren't many American archaeologists working in Syria then, very few. So it was a rather daring thing for him to do, but he pulled it off. And I was working with him, and we started working there. We didn't know anything about Syria. We didn't know any Arabic. It was all just from scratch. But the Syrians were really friendly, very warm, very hospitable, and the whole place was, incredibly fascinating. So it was a big adventure that worked.
All right. And so how important do you think that alphabetical scripts could come into, well, ancient societies? Like, what importance do you think alphabetical scripts have in, well, ancient society, seeing that you have discovered one of the oldest ones?
Yeah, right. If I'm right, and I'm not completely convinced that I'm right, by the way. I mean, there are other interpretations that are possible. But if what I'm proposing is right, then indeed I have found the oldest example of alphabetic writing currently known, which dates to something like 2350 BC from one of my sites in Syria. The importance of the alphabet is that it's much simpler to learn than earlier writing systems. So you have in Egypt, they had hieroglyphs, and in
Mm.
Mesopotamia, they had cuneiform writing, which is writing in little wedge-shaped characters on clay tablets.
Yeah.
And Mesopotamian and Egyptian writing, they're not alphabetic, and they're very complicated. They have, in both of those systems, you might have some characters. You have one character that stands for a word. So, it might be a character that looks like a sort of squiggly character, and it stands for the word water. And then other characters stand for combinations of sounds. So maybe several consonants together, or maybe a syllable or several syllables together. But an alphabet, each character stands only for one sound, for either one consonant or one vowel. That means you only need maybe 20 alphabetic characters, or maybe as much as 40. But in Egyptian and Mesopotamian writing, they had hundreds and hundreds of characters. So it was very difficult to learn. And usually it was restricted to a very small number of people, and people that were employed by the political authorities, by the high-ranking people. So it was restricted to the elite in one way or another. But without the alphabet, it was easier to learn. It didn't take as much time. So a lot more people could learn it, and it didn't have to be monopolized by the people in power.
We have learned about the rise and collapse of ancient urban civilizations, but what have you learned about them, and what do these lessons from the rise and collapse teach us about modern civilizations?
Well, the issue of collapse is, of course, could be very relevant to our concerns in the present day, you know,
Yeah.
with concerns about global warming, especially. In the case of ancient societies, there are a number of cases where the societies did suffer significant changes that we call collapses, which usually means that the political organization fell apart, and sometimes the cities were abandoned, or they lost large percentages of their population, or sometimes even not just cities, but smaller communities were abandoned. You have like mass abandonments of regions. So we're of course very interested in why this happened, and there's a lot of debate in all these cases, but very often there are two issues that are brought up, and one is climate change. So there's a case, for instance, in the ancient Near East, where there is what seems like collapsing going on around 2200 BC. And the evidence from climatological sources is that there was a climate change around that time. And the climate change was took the form of a big drying up of the climate. So there's quite a lot of interest in, is that the reason that these societies experience these collapses, these big changes? Is it because they didn't have enough water for farming and then thus they couldn't feed themselves? So all the big populations in the cities, they had to be fed, and you had to have a lot of agricultural
Mm.
production to do that. And if the agriculture wasn't working because there wasn't enough rain, or enough water for irrigation, that could throw the whole
Mhm.
system, uh, out of whack. So obviously, since we are having a climate change of our own at the moment, it's interesting to see,
The past,
how,
how it
yes,
dealt with it.
how
Yeah.
we deal with it. So, in some cases, it looks like the ancient people either ignored it or perhaps tried doing things that weren't really. So, in the case of the Maya, for example, this is not Near Eastern, but in the case of the Maya in Central America, like in Mexico and so forth, there are some indications that they thought, oh, the gods are not happy with us, and so they're not sending rain. Therefore, we should build more temples, or the gods want human sacrifices to sustain themselves. So let's make more human sacrifices. And neither more temples nor more sacrifices, of course, would help if there was a climatological problem. So it's a kind of a lesson on how to face such a problem and maybe things not to do. And one of the things not to do would be to pretend that the problem doesn't exist.
And so we're just
Another
adapt.
and
Yeah.
also the other major another major issue that I alluded to was um, changes that occurred that were the result of what people themselves did. So the climate is something in ancient times they had no control over.
Hmm.
But they also there's some suggestions that these civilizations they had a big effect on their physical environments. So because, for example, they had to feed all these growing populations, they had to cultivate more and more farmland, which means they had to cut down lots of trees, and they had to get as much food out of their fields as they could. And that had an effect on the environment. So that there could be environmental degradation that occurred. And that might have had an effect too, which is also, of course, a very modern concern, right?
Mm.
So it's again interesting to see how they faced these problems and what happened when the problems took effect.
All right, all right. And so, part of archaeology, I suppose, is also deciphering the alphabet and all of that. And so, my question is, have you been using AI like this? Because we all know that it's really big nowadays. It's like the buzziest thing that we hear all the time. And do you actually use it for your research?
That's a good question. I don't yet. Um, but I'm wondering if it's possible to do so. I was just talking to some AI experts last week at a holiday party about this this, how could I use AI? But in terms of the alphabetic inscriptions, if that's what they are, um, what I guess what you'd want to do is to compare the individual symbols on each text to known alphabetic symbols from other texts and see which ones they are closest, that
Mhm.
they look most like. So to do that, you'd have to have a database of, all the other alphabetic texts, early alphabetic texts that we know of that AI could then manipulate. And I don't think we have a database like that yet. So I
Mm.
don't think I can't use AI yet, really.
And so, well, can you explain because like you were saying in archaeology, you work in groups, right? And so how important is it to work in groups and why is it so important in archaeology?
Mm. Uh, it's you couldn't do it without working in a group. A single person couldn't bring it off. So when you're doing field work, so doing excavations at an ancient site, an ancient city, you find, first of all, that requires, if it was just one person digging, you wouldn't get very much done, right? You just dig maybe a
Yeah.
corner of a room and that's all. So you need a lot of people simply to do the actual digging and people to record what's being dug, keep records of it all, people photographing what's happening, people drawing the ancient architecture or the ancient objects. And when you're digging an ancient city or an ancient town, whatever, you're likely to find the bones of animals that they were using either to eat or to have for labor or whatever. And so you need an expert in the analysis of animal bones, somebody who's learned how to analyze such bones and figure out what species, you have an animal bone. You have to say, okay, what species is it? What part of the body is it from? How was it used? Is there evidence of butchery, et cetera, et
Mm.
cetera? So there's really quite a number of specialists that you need to work with you. Some of them from the natural sciences, some from the social sciences, some from the humanities. When you're doing archaeology, it involves this, it's the study of people, right? The study of ancient people. And people are complicated, and you need different experts to try to explain and interpret what people were doing and the kinds
Yeah.
of objects that
Mm.
they used. And so it's interesting when you are an archaeologist and you're working in the field with maybe 15, 20, 30, 40 people, that's a skill that you might not expect, but you have to learn how to work with other people and how to get along with other people and how to and if you're the director of a project like I've been, you have to learn, okay, if these two people aren't getting along, how do I help them learn to work with each other? Or um, if these people are not having a good time, how to figure out how to get them to enjoy the experience. So that's archaeology involves many different skills, which is one of the things I love about it. It isn't just a single thing. So you have to learn how to analyze ancient cities and ancient objects and all that, but you also have to learn how to work as a team and also to direct a team.
So no, so what you're saying is that not only it's well passion, of course, but it also teaches you crucial life skills, of course. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you ever faced in your career as an archaeologist?
Well, it was a challenge to find a full-time job. Um, Back when I was looking for a job, um, the number of professorships in the study of Near Eastern archaeology was somewhat limited. So I did manage to get some postdoctoral fellowships that allowed me to do my research, but they were only for a year or 2 years, something like that. So it actually took a while for me to finally get lucky and get a professorship. And the lesson that I took from that was if you really want something, then you have to be persistent. I could have if it didn't work for a year or two, I could have given up. But I really wanted to do it, so I just kept on trying to figure out ways to feed myself while I was looking for a job, and finally it did work. So persistence is important.
Okay, okay. And so, what are some of the biggest questions which still remain mysteries to you in your career? Like, what are the biggest mysteries that you have yet to solve and that you really wish solving?
Hmm. Well, one of the big questions that I'm very curious about is
Mhm.
in the birth of urban civilization. So one of my main foci is the birth of cities when cities were first built and first occupied, and the civilizations that went along with them, where because along with cities you have the kinds of societies like ours, which had very large populations and big, large-scale, complex political organizations. That's the time period when you start having kingdoms and kings and so forth. And also when writing was invented. That's when writing was invented, when you have the first cities and the first urban civilizations. So presiding over these early urban civilizations usually are very powerful and wealthy people, the elite, we can call them.
Mhm.
And they tell everybody else what to do. They collect large proportions of the resources of the society. They're really rich. And I've always wondered how they managed to get that position. How do they manage to convince everybody else that they deserved to be so rich and so powerful?
Yeah.
Or was it simply a question of them forcing
Mhm.
everybody to go along with it? So that's a mystery that I'm still working on. Clearly, one tool that they used must have been religion, where the elite said the gods want this to happen. I'm appointed by the gods, and so you should go along with this because that's what the gods want. But you still have to try. I still don't understand how they got everybody else to agree that the gods wanted this to happen.
Yeah,
So it's for me that's a fascinating but difficult mystery to untangle.
I see. And so, what are some of the, like biggest things that you want to achieve going forward in your career? What are some of the biggest goals you want to achieve next?
So I've been digging first in Syria and then in Iraq for a long time, right? So when you excavate, like I mentioned before, you're collecting large amounts of information about their ancient buildings, about their ancient tools, their ancient weapons, their ways of life, how they interacted with animals, how their society worked. So you're getting a huge amount of information, and so it's the responsibility of the archaeologist to analyze this information and then to publish your results. So really, my main goal now is to publish the results of all the digging that I did.
Hmm.
I published two big books so far on the results of my excavations. But if I'm really responsible, there should be many more big books coming out.
Hopefully. course.
Yes.
Yeah. So, after having this amazing interview with you, Mr. Glenn Schwartz, what is your message to the viewers watching this video, and what is your message to people around the world?
Well, my message would be that if you're interested in archaeology, there are a lot of things still left to do. Sometimes people think that, oh, we've dug so much, we've done so much already, there's nothing left. But we've only accessed a tiny fraction of the archaeological heritage. So there's a huge amount to do, and I'm sure there'll be many, many fascinating results. But at the same time, there's a challenge in that the archaeological heritage is in danger, like so many other aspects of our world. So, with development, when building new buildings, new cities, new highways, archaeological sites get destroyed. So we have to be aware that the archaeological heritage is important and is in danger, is often in danger, and that we have to try to work to protect it. Um,
Okay.
and I hope that we will.
Well, great. Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Glenn Schwartz. I hope that you enjoy it. And I hope that, well, we learned a lot from you, and that hopefully some people watching this video might get inspired and follow your footsteps. Well, thank you.